So if you've been following along this far in this rolling backup series, then you'll know that we've covered a lot of stuff. Different ways to play over different chords, chord progressions, some patterns, some classic licks, a lot of the stuff that you would need to play rolling backup as a bluegrass banjo player. But one thing we haven't covered yet is short chord durations. Of course, we've talked about 1-measure patterns and 2-measure patterns and 3 and 4, and you can repeat them all as much as you like. But what if you want to play less than 1 measure? What if you're playing a chord for half a measure? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. In this installment of the Rolling Backup series, we're going to talk about playing half-measure chords. And while it's not quite as common as longer chord durations that you'll see like 1 or 2 measures or even more than that, it's something that you're going to see often enough that you're going to want to know how to deal with it. If you're looking for some examples of where you might find this kind of thing, you can think of the classic vocal songs like Down the Road or Little Georgia Rose, and you can find this all over the place in fiddle tunes like Cumberland Gap or Blackberry Blossom. But how do we actually play this stuff? Well, let's first just look at some things that you can do that last half a measure, and then we'll see how we can apply that to some actual chord progressions. The first thing you can do is just play quarter notes. You don't actually have to play eighth notes all the time. I know this is a rolling backup series, but in the middle of rolling backup, people tend to actually play things other than eighth notes. So one thing you could do is just play a quarter note and a pinch like this. Another thing you can do is play a quarter note and 2 eighth notes, which is basically just taking that quarter note and a pinch and separating the pinch into 2 notes, like this. If you do want to play eighth notes, then we have to play 4 eighth notes. That's half of 1 measure. So what are some different ways that we could play 4 eighth notes? Well, you could play just forward roll, thumb, index, middle, thumb. That's 4 eighth notes. We've got the forward roll, so why not do a backward roll? Middle, index, thumb, middle. Another way to play 4 consecutive eighth notes would be an alternating roll, thumb, index, thumb, middle. By the way, if you want tablature for all the examples in this video, as well as all of my videos, then you can find that at patreon.com/EliGilbertBanjo, which is where I post all the bonus content for all of my videos, stuff that you can't find here on YouTube. Also, if you don't mind, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. That's another huge way that you can help me make more of these videos. So if you do that, I really appreciate it. Anyway, back to the lesson. Now, those are all the patterns that we're going to use today for half-measure chords, but I should give you a little more context. That's not necessarily exactly the strings that we're going to use. We're not going to use them exactly on those chords necessarily. That's just the basic concept. Forward roll, backward roll, alternating roll, quarter notes, pinches, all that sort of stuff. But you can apply that to different strings and different chords in a lot of different ways. And the reason I'm not being very specific about it right now is that a lot of this stuff is really situational. The deal with half-measure chords is that you have to get in and out of a chord really quickly. And depending on what you're playing before you get there, you're going to have to start on a different finger and end on a different finger and all that sort of stuff. And there isn't really a mathematical equation to figure out exactly what the perfect thing to do is. So we want to keep this really kind of flexible so that we can do different things depending on the situation. That might not make a ton of sense right now, but hopefully you'll see once we get into these patterns that depending on how you start them, you're going to end up landing on either your thumb or your index or your middle, and that might influence you to play a certain pattern for the half-measure chord. By now, you probably do know that if you're playing a lot of forward rolls over and over again, sometimes when you get to the beginning of a measure, you're on your thumb, sometimes you're on your index, sometimes you're on the middle, and you want to have a couple different options so that you always have something that you can play, because it's really hard to plan ahead 4 measures in advance. So we're going to try to get comfortable with all these options. But again, there's no formula. I'm not getting really exact about it. It's just something that you start to get comfortable with as you find that your only option is the thumb, you're going to use the thumb. If your only option is your middle finger, you're going to use the middle finger. And as long as you've got a pattern that starts on each one of those fingers, you'll have an option to play. Anyway, it's finally time to look at some of these examples. One of the most common situations in which you'll come across these half-measure chords are in tunes like Sally Gooden or Cumberland Gap, where it's mostly one chord, in this case G, but at the end, the last measure is D to G, half measure of D, half measure of G. So you have to play 3 measures of G and then 1 measure at the end that has 2 half measure segments. So here's how I would deal with that using some of the examples I just showed you. Now, all the material for the chord G, those 3 measures of G, is pretty much just the stuff from the previous lessons in this series. But you'll notice that there are 2 different ways that I'm dealing with the D to G move that all take place in 1 measure. In the first example, I'm playing the forward roll for D, and then when I get to G, I'm just playing 2 quarter notes. That seems simple enough, but then the next time I do the opposite and I play a backward roll followed by 2 quarter notes. So why did I do 1 the first time and 1 the next time? Well, it all had to do with what I played beforehand. And I wasn't really planning any of it necessarily. I mean, I did for this video, but in general, I don't plan it. I just happen to play different things leading up to that. And depending on what I have available to me, I'm going to make a different choice. If you look at the end of the measure preceding the half measure of D, I end up on my ring finger. That means I have to start the next measure with either the thumb or the index, so I just have to use one of the patterns that starts with those fingers. The next time through, I end on my index finger, which means that I have to start with either my thumb or my middle finger because I don't want to repeat with my index finger. And that's kind of it. These aren't really special patterns or really the right patterns to play for this progression. It's just that I played stuff that ended up influencing me to make these choices. If you play a different combination of licks, it's going to end up leading you to a different place. So even though I am going to show you more examples in different keys, for instance, or on different songs, just know that nothing that I'm showing you is like the best, most perfect licks that you can play in these scenarios. It just happens to be what is an easy thing to play once I get to that point. You're totally capable of coming up with all of this stuff on your own, given that you know how to play quarter notes and a forward roll and a backward roll and an alternating roll. All you have to do is apply it to the right chord shape. And you might not immediately land on the perfect way to do it, but because there are so many different options, it really is something that you have to kind of just wade through yourself and see which different roll patterns will work. That said, I do think these examples are a good way to practice this stuff. So here's the same progression, just the 1 chord and the 5 chord in the keys of C and D as well. As you can see, we're handling this all pretty much in the same way. We're taking material from the previous lessons in this series, and then once we get to the half measure chord, we're using whatever pattern is convenient and applying it to the correct chord shape. And this really works equally well between any 2 chords. It's not just between a 1 chord and a 5 chord. So here, as an example, is Little Georgia Rose in the key of G, which has a short 4 chord, which is C. As you can see, there's a lot of different material going on here, but when I play the C chord, I'm either playing that alternating roll or a quarter note and a pinch. And again, it's not special for any particular reason. I just chose material that I liked for G and D, and then when I got to C, depending on what I had already played, I just started something with an available finger. But what about if there are a lot of half measure chords? So far, we've looked at a situation where just once in a while we play a half measure chord, which is really not that big a deal. But what about in certain fiddle tunes where a lot of what we end up playing is half measure chords? One of the most common questions I get is how to play rolling backup on a tune like Blackberry Blossom, which is mostly half measure chords. On the A section, that's pretty much all you do. And the truth is, I mostly don't play rolling backup on a tune like Blackberry Blossom. And I'm not alone in that. Go check out most banjo players playing Blackberry Blossom. There's not a lot of rolling backup happening on the A section. Maybe sometimes, maybe for part of the A section, but a lot of people aren't really playing this kind of rolling backup, switching chords that frequently. That said, it is a great way to practice this stuff because it's going to be a lot of different chord changes, which means you really have to be comfortable with this stuff. So it's totally worth doing anyway. So then here's just one way that I would play rolling backup on Blackberry Blossom. Now, if you go over this and look at each half measure section, you'll see it's just the patterns I showed you in different combinations, on different strings, different chords. It's not always going to be on the same strings, that sort of thing, but it all kind of flows together. And this isn't something that I learned from a particular banjo player, and it's not these particular special Blackberry Blossom licks. It's just something that I kind of slowly worked out and connected, where I knew that if I played this pattern into this pattern, then I could smoothly make this transition from one chord to another. This is really one of those situations where you have to trust your own ear and do a little experimenting. You don't necessarily want to play the same pattern over and over again, but you might also not like every combination of patterns, so you're gonna have to try a couple different things. Choose different strings, different chord shapes, that sort of stuff. And hopefully, if you've seen enough of my videos, then you'll know that I'm not withholding information right now. I'm just trying to share the information that helped me understand how to do this sort of stuff. And in this case, the information that helped me was just simple patterns that I had to figure out myself, different ways that you could connect different chords with different chord shapes. The examples I've showed you will be super useful, and you can practice these examples and they'll work great for these exact situations. But there will come other times when you have to play other chords for other durations, and you might have to find out your own solution. Of course, if you want to know a little bit more about the way that I practice this stuff, you can head to Patreon. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and like this video. All that stuff is super helpful. But otherwise, that's going to do it for this lesson. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.